This is a grandmother who is already 90 years old. Every year on Valentine's Day, she dresses up and comes to the train station to wait for her husband, because her husband had promised her he would come back on Valentine's Day one year. But now 65 years have passed. Her husband still hasn't come back. Looking at the crowded exit, she hoped that her husband would suddenly appear in the next second. Expectations over and over again are met with disappointment. 65 years, for 65 Valentine's Days, the old granny would come to the station, rain or shine, waiting for her husband's return. Now she has gray hair, but her husband still looks the same in the photo. Looking at her husband and herself, it reminds her of that afternoon 65 years ago. At this particular time and place, the parting was inevitable. The two of them had no choice but to say their final goodbyes. The husband rubbed Caroline's belly and promised he would be back before the baby was born. "I'll deliver the baby myself." A loudspeaker on the hall radio was announcing the train's imminent arrival. Despite all the reluctance in her heart, military orders were hard to disobey. He could only take Caroline's hand and rush to the platform. On the way, Caroline's face was as black as charcoal. It was as if she expected something to happen to her husband, and the husband seemed to see what was coming. He took Caroline into his arms in a panic. He promised her he'd be back in one piece when the war was over. "Don't forget, I'm going to deliver our baby myself." Until the train was about to leave, her husband pushed Caroline onto the platform. As she watched her husband leave, Caroline realized she hadn't given her husband the card she'd made. She hurriedly ran all the way to the carriage where her husband was. The card was handed over to her husband, although it was just a piece of useless paper. But in Caroline's heart it meant a great deal. It contained not only wishes for her husband, but also her hopes for the future. She asked her husband to keep the card with him at all times, until he returned safely, and returned the card to Caroline. After seeing her husband leave, Caroline began a journey of hope that lasted more than 60 years. During the first days of her husband's absence, she couldn't even get used to being alone on a 2-meter bed. Whenever she writes a letter, she puts bright lipstick on her lips. Then she'd print it on the envelope. That way her love would be transmitted to her husband through her letters. She wrote 1 letter a day sometimes too, maybe because of the distance, or maybe it's the inconvenience of transportation. Each time she sent a letter, it took a week for her husband to receive them, and so it went back and forth. From the time she sent a letter to the time her husband wrote back, it often took as long as half a month. So the two of them continued to communicate in this way for months, and this time there seemed to be something extra in the letters sent back. When Caroline pulled it out, she realized it was a model airplane carved out of wood. The husband also mentioned in his letter that he said he couldn't come back because of the war there. "This airplane model was a gift for my child." In the days that followed, Caroline continued to write to her husband every day, but this time, 2 months had passed, but she never received any reply from her husband, not even a letter to tell him he was safe. Watching her neighbors cry when they received the letters, it scared Caroline to death. She was afraid that one day she would receive such a letter. In the midst of this struggle between fear and anticipation, the baby was born a few days later. She named the baby Safety. It means peace and safety. After the baby was born, her bad mood seemed to get better. Since it was her first time giving birth, it kept Caroline so busy every day, so much so that she didn't have a moment to miss her husband. And so the days went by. She tried to write to her husband, but she got no reply, until the baby was almost a year old. She was washing clothes in the yard. Suddenly she heard on the radio that the war was coming to an end. If that's the case, then her husband will be back soon. The thought of it made Caroline instantly happy. Ideal is rich, but reality is bone dry. With the arrival of the letter carrier, Caroline's heart dropped. Her husband had been declared a missing person. The letter stated that it was possible that her husband was alive but could not be found, or he could be dead, but they can't classify him as killed in action without a body, so they're classified as missing for now. But Caroline's conviction was unshakable.